Right. So Vancouver housing, it's a hot topic, and I know you've been deep in the research on this.
Yeah.
Probably feeling like a mix of wow, this is bad, and also like what can we even do about it?
Yeah.
So we're gonna tackle that do part today. Specifically those policies around, increasing density, multiplexes, laneway houses, secondary suites. Canada's got these ambitious goals for new homes. So I guess the big question is, are these things game changers or are they just a drop in the bucket?
Well, I think what's interesting right off the bat is that Vancouver, like a lot of cities, is kind of caught in this tension between wanting more housing, obviously, but also this desire to kind of preserve that neighborhood character. So these policies that allow for more units on a single property, they're almost like a compromise in a way.
Yeah, compromise. That's a good way to put it. It's like, okay, we're not going full high rise on every block, but how about we squeeze in a duplex here, a laneway house there?
Yeah.
But then the question becomes, is that actually enough?
Exactly. And are those policies even working, as intended? That's where I think we have to get into like the nitty-gritty of zoning, regulations, and honestly, the economics of all of it. Because just because you can legally build a fourplex doesn't mean that it makes sense to do so.
Right. Financially.
Right.
Okay, so let's break this down. For anyone listening who's not a total real estate nerd like we are,
Right.
What exactly are these missing middle options? I know we've thrown out some jargon, multiplexes, laneway houses. Like, what are we even talking about?
Right. Well, it's really about filling that gap between detached single-family homes and those big apartment complexes, So imagine a street. It's mostly single-family homes. A multiplex could be a duplex, triplex, fourplex. It's basically one building with multiple self-contained units.
Okay.
Laneway houses, those are the smaller detached units.
Yeah.
Usually built behind the main house, often accessed from a back alley.
Oh, okay.
And then you've got secondary suites. Those are essentially legal apartments within an existing house.
Okay, so it's like taking existing properties and kind of making them work harder, housing-wise. But I'm already getting that feeling of devil in the details here. I was reading that even when these are allowed, the actual number of new units being built is kind of underwhelming.
Yeah, it is. I mean, California is a good example. They passed this law in 2022, allowing up to 4 units on a single-family lot.
Sounds good.
Right, sounds great. Problem is, across the entire state, only 53 development applications were approved under that policy.
53 for the whole state of California. That's shockingly low.
It is. It is really low. And it's not just California, right? We see similar trends in other cities that have tried to encourage missing middle housing. So clearly something's not adding up. We need to figure out why these policies aren't translating into, actual housing.
Okay, so it's not as simple as just flipping a switch and saying, all right, everybody build more units. There are these underlying factors at play here. What are some of the biggest roadblocks, What's making this harder than it seems like it should be?
Well, I think one major issue is size restrictions. A lot of cities still have rules about how big new buildings can be in single-family neighborhoods, even if they allow for things like multiplexes. Often, these multiplexes have to have the same footprint as an existing single-family home.
So you're squeezing in more units, but each one is, like, tiny. That doesn't seem very practical.
Yeah.
Especially for families.
Yeah, exactly. A young professional might be fine with a micro studio, but families need more space, right? And if these missing middle options are really going to make a dent in the housing crisis, they have to work for a range of needs. It's not just about quantity. It's about creating housing that's actually livable.
Right. It has to actually function for people.
Exactly.
Okay, so size restrictions are one hurdle. What else is making this tough for developers to actually get these things built?
Well, then you get into the added costs and requirements. In Vancouver, for example, there's a density bonus zoning contribution that developers have to pay, which, can add over $770,000 per unit. Yeah, so imagine you're a developer, right? You're just trying to keep costs down. And you get hit with a fee that's basically the price of a whole other house.
Yeah. Wait, a density bonus? It seems like it should be the opposite. It seems like that would discourage the exact kind of development we're trying to encourage.
It does, doesn't it? But this is where it gets complex, right? The city might argue that this fee helps to offset, the impact of increased density on infrastructure and amenities, but it definitely adds another layer of cost for developers to deal with. And then you have things like parking requirements.
Parking, the classic city issue. So how does parking fit into this whole multiplex situation?
Some cities, they mandate a certain number of parking spaces per unit. And for multiplexes, that could mean building, like
Yeah.
Expensive underground parking structures,
Yeah.
which, eats into the budget.
Right, right. So we've got size restrictions, extra fees, parking. It's starting to feel like, even if the intention's good, the reality is that these policies are kind of making it really hard to get these missing middle homes built.
It is. It's kind of like wanting to bake a cake.
Yeah.
But realizing you're missing, like, key ingredients. And the oven's not even working, right? You might have the recipe, but actually getting that cake on the table, it's a whole other story.
Right. So with all these challenges, how come anyone's building them at all?
That's a good question. And that's where I think we have to bring in the cold, hard reality of financial viability developers.
Yeah.
Especially smaller ones who might be interested in doing a duplex or a triplex. They need to make a profit to secure loans and make these projects worthwhile. I mean, think about it. You wouldn't start a business if you knew you were going to lose money, right?
Right. Of course not. But then how do we balance that? The need for more affordable housing with the fact that developers need to make a profit. It feels like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah. It is a tricky situation. Let's walk through a hypothetical scenario. Say a developer wants to build a 4-unit multiplex in Vancouver. Okay, first they got to buy the land. In a desirable area, that land could easily cost $1 million or more.
Yeah, that's a hefty starting point.
It is. And then you add in construction costs, lumber, labor, the whole 9 yards. Those have been skyrocketing lately. And then don't forget those pesky fees we talked about.
Right.
Now, to make a reasonable profit, the developer needs to sell those units at a certain price. But if the costs are too high, they might have to charge like exorbitant prices, which makes them unaffordable for, the very people who need them most.
Right. Yeah, it's a classic catch-22. We need more affordable housing. But the system seems stacked against making it happen in a way that actually benefits people.
It is. It's a tricky situation. And this is playing out in cities, all over the world. But there is good news. There are cities that are figuring this out, places that are seeing real progress in terms of boosting housing supply and affordability.
Okay, I need some optimism right now. Tell me about these success stories.
Okay, well, one particularly inspiring example is Auckland, New Zealand. Back in 2016, they decided to take a pretty bold approach to their housing crisis. They essentially rezoned over 3/4 of their residential land to allow for more density.
Wow.
Yeah, this wasn't just like tweaking around the edges. They went all in on allowing more housing in areas that were traditionally single-family only.
That sounds like a pretty radical move. Did they get pushback from homeowners who didn't want their neighborhoods to change?
I mean, there was definitely some resistance, as with any major policy shift. But I think what Auckland did really well was care. This increase in density with other, smart policy changes. For example, they significantly reduced parking minimums.
Ah, so they acknowledged that
Right.
those parking requirements can really add a lot of cost to projects.
Exactly. And can discourage building denser housing. They also streamline regulations to make the approval process for new housing more efficient. It was basically like, look, if we want more housing, we need to make it easier to build.
So it sounds like they took this holistic approach, recognizing that there's no single magic bullet here. It's about creating a whole ecosystem that supports more housing development.
Yeah.
What were the actual results of these changes? Did they actually see more housing get built?
Yeah, I mean, the results were pretty impressive. Over a 5-year period, Auckland saw over 20,000 additional new dwellings built.
Wow.
That's significant. And what's even more encouraging is that some studies suggest that rents in Auckland actually stabilized or even decreased slightly in the years following these zoning changes.
That's what I'm talking about. It sounds like they actually found a way to strike that balance, encourage development while keeping housing relatively affordable. But, is it really that simple? Can Vancouver just, copy and paste what Auckland did and expect the same results?
It's probably not quite that straightforward. I mean, every city has its own context, its own set of challenges and opportunities. But I think there are some key takeaways from Auckland's success that are relevant for cities around the world.
All right, I'm all ears. What can Vancouver learn?
Well, first of all, I think they need to be willing to make those trade-offs. If they truly want to address the housing crisis, they have to accept that some neighborhoods might see taller buildings and denser housing. It's about acknowledging that change is necessary if we want to create more homes for people.
Change can be scary, especially when it comes to where people live.
It is.
So how do you convince communities that this is a good thing?
Well, I think it's about framing it as a win-win, right?
Yeah.
Denser, more walkable neighborhoods often have lower carbon footprints. They support local businesses, and they create more opportunities for social interaction. It's not just about cramming more people into a smaller space. It's about creating, more vibrant, sustainable, and inclusive communities.
Okay, yeah. It's not just about changing zoning laws. It's about changing mindsets, too. But what about those added costs and regulations we talked about earlier? Those are still a major barrier, even if people are on board with denser housing in theory.
Absolutely. And I think this is where we need to get creative and explore some alternative approaches. One interesting concept is strata titling.
Strata titling. Now, for those of us who don't speak fluent real estate, can you explain what that is?
Sure. It's basically a way to divide a property into multiple individually owned units. So instead of having one big house on a lot, you could have, say, a main house and a separate laneway house, each with its own title.
Oh, okay. So it's like creating like mini condominiums within a single property.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. How'd that help with the housing situation?
Well, I think it could be a game changer for things like laneway houses. Currently, in a lot of cities, homeowners are only allowed to rent out their laneway houses. But with strata titling, they could actually sell them.
Oh, I see. So that could be a huge incentive for people to build laneway houses. They could downsize into the smaller unit and sell the main house, or they could, generate some extra income by selling the laneway house. It's like unlocking a whole new level of housing options.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like strata titling could really shake things up.
Yeah.
Especially for those folks who are, sitting on a big property.
Yeah.
But don't necessarily need all that space. It's almost like you're turning your home into like a mini development project.
Yeah.
But without having to be a big time developer.
Right, exactly. It really empowers individual homeowners to become like part of the solution. And it's not just strata titling. I mean, cities are exploring other innovative approaches like pre-approved building plans for multiplexes. This can cut down on, the time and money it takes to get through the approval process, which makes these projects more appealing to smaller developers.
It's like, it's like those meal kit services.
Was there housing?
Yeah.
You get the blueprints and a streamlined process,
yeah,
making it easier to digest or, well, in this case, build. I love that analogy. That's a great analogy. And speaking of making things easier, there's this fantastic organization here in BC called Small Housing BC, and they're doing amazing work to promote what they call gentle density housing and help communities kind of embrace these new housing forms.
So they're like cheerleaders for missing middle housing, helping people understand the benefits and navigate, all the steps.
Exactly. They offer resources, best practices, even like model designs to help homeowners and developers understand the ins and outs of, building these types of homes.
That's great. So for our listener out there who's been digging into all this housing stuff, it sounds like Small Housing BC would be a great next step. It's like that friend who's already done the research and can give you the inside scoop.
Totally. Couldn't agree more. Because at the end of the day, we need all hands on deck to tackle this housing crisis. It's not just policymakers or developers, it's communities, individual homeowners. Everyone needs to be part of the conversation and the solution.
Yeah, it's a collective effort for sure. But I got to admit, it can feel overwhelming. You look at the sheer number of homes that Canada needs to build in the coming years. It's easy to get discouraged.
Yeah, it's true. The scale of the challenge is massive. But I think it's important to remember that every single new unit of housing makes a difference. Whether it's a laneway house, a duplex, a small apartment building, each one represents a home for someone, a place for them to put down roots and build their lives.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the weeds of policy and regulations. But ultimately, this is about people. It's about making sure everyone has a safe, affordable place to call home. And that's what keeps me motivated to keep learning and talking about this issue.
Absolutely. And I think if we keep that human element at the forefront, I think we can find a path forward.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. The challenges, the potential solutions, even a glimpse of hope with Auckland's success. But what does all this mean for you, our listener? What can you do to be a part of the solution, especially, in a city like Vancouver?
Well, I think this brings us back to those uncomfortable truths we touched on earlier. We have to be honest with ourselves that solving this crisis requires trade-offs. It might mean accepting some changes to our neighborhoods, maybe being okay with taller buildings or fewer parking spaces.
It's tough, but I think you're right. If we're serious about creating more housing, especially affordable housing, then we have to be open to new ways of thinking. about our cities and our neighborhoods.
Exactly, and that's where individual action comes in,
Yeah.
right? Educate yourself about the different types of missing middle housing, explore those resources from Small Housing BC, and talk to your elected officials about your concerns and your hopes for, the future of housing in Vancouver.
Yeah. Don't just sit on the sidelines. Get informed, get involved, and make your voice heard. And remember, change starts at the local level. Your actions and your choices can make a difference.
Totally.
So if you had to pick one big takeaway, what do you want our listener to walk away with today?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the most important message is that we're not powerless in the face of this crisis. There are solutions out there, and we can all play a role in making them a reality. It starts with shifting our mindset, being open to new ideas, and working together to create a future where everyone has a place to call home.
That's a great way to put it. Beautifully said.
Thanks.
And thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
Of course. It's always a pleasure to explore these complex issues and brainstorm potential solutions.
And to our listener, thanks for joining us. It's a complex issue, but it's also one, filled with possibility.
Okay.
With a little bit of creativity, collaboration, and maybe a few deep breaths along the way. I'm confident we can build a future where everyone has a place to call home. Until next time, happy diving.